They say growing up in the country can make people stronger, sharper, and more in tune with their instincts than their city folk counterparts. Something about the wild just brings out the inner animal in human beings. After all, that's what we are at heart, animals. When my father was alive, he would always speak about the joys of hunting. The waiting game, the thrill of looking down the scope of that rifle and seeing your prey right in the crosshairs. The satisfaction of bagging your own food and preparing it from scratch. There was nothing Dad loved more than snagging a buck or whatever he could manage to get out there. Which makes it all the more ironic that he died on a trip. Albeit in a deeply morbid sort of way. In that wild, untamed, and hostile environment, anything can happen to even the most experienced and greatest hunters. The last thing that you ever want to do in a place you don't belong is become arrogant. Arrogance is what gets you killed. When my dad had passed, our neighbor, Mr. Roberts, had offered to take me in and become my legal guardian. He had always been a hardworking man. His farm was not like any other that I had ever seen. The crops were fresh, ripe, and always sold well at the farmer's market with incredible demand. The quality of his fields were impressively high for only one man doing all the labor. I even heard people speaking of his work whenever we went into town for small supply runs or to visit family. I had watched him get up early for years and go to work, with an intrigued smile on my face. Something about it was almost mystical. The sound of the tractor roaring to the soft crunch of hay bales smacking together, as he stacked them one on top of another, became comforting to my young mind. But as I watched Mr. Roberts become slower and more fragile in his older age, I could tell that the workload of the farm was beginning to overwhelm him, mentally and physically. Every time that he stepped in the house, his exhaustion was as clear as day, drenched in sweat, huffing like he had completed a marathon. Half the time, he would limp over to the couch and collapse on like a human ragdoll. That's when I began to do my part and help out more, pitching in whenever I could, and making sure that he didn't end up injuring himself in his more frail state. Mr. Roberts had always told me one rule that I absolutely had to follow. No matter how dire these circumstances became, he would even utilize scare tactics on me when I was younger, and telling me that I would be cursed for all of eternity if I were to ever break the rule. He became even more strict about it as he aged. I simply chalked it up to a slowly degrading mental state. "Don't go underneath the barn." He always warned me sternly with a fiery passion in his eyes, despite the fact that he had usually been pretty laid back and calm about most things. But when it came to the secret room underneath the barn, he was almost totalitarian in his mannerisms about it. We all know how humans work. Telling someone to not do something only makes them desire to disobey and do it anyway. The thrill of doing something you're not supposed to is a feeling that we can all relate to. The more that Mr. Roberts went on about the room beneath the barn, the more curious I became. I even made the naive assumption that maybe whatever was down there wasn't even a big deal, and he was simply overblowing it for a dramatic effect. But I had no clue why he was so protective of it. So, when I finally made the foolish decision to do the one thing that I was demanded not to, I had waited inside the house one early afternoon until Mr. Roberts had gotten in his truck and drove into town to grab something from the store. That's what he told me anyway. I quickly grabbed my key, locked the door to the house behind me, and set out across the field down to the barn, letting the cool fall breeze rest against my back as I marched on. The reality of the situation only really hit me when I was less than 100 feet from the barn. The familiar smell of manure and sounds of cows mooing didn't comfort me in the slightest. But I didn't want to be a coward at the last minute and chicken out. I kept going despite my unease, letting leaves be crunched beneath my dirt-stained boots. When I finally arrived at the barn entrance and unlocked the heavy door, I was quickly greeted by the ruckus of all the animals performing their typical noises and movements, nearly all of them snapping to attention and turning their heads towards me. Nice to see you guys too. I waved politely to the diverse set of creatures before continuing down the middle, between all the pens and to the floor hatch at the back wall. Grabbing the thick rope handle, I began to pull the hatch open with a strained groan, putting myself in a stance similar to the deadlift position to pull it up, only to find that it wouldn't budge despite me using my full effort to hoist it up. Dang it, I huffed, my previous state of unease now morphing into unsatisfied frustration. I reached down once again and tried to pull the hatch a couple more times, but to no avail. I used every bit of strength I could muster to lift it open, but it soon became clear that it was futile to keep trying. I repositioned myself, taking in my surroundings and crossing my arms in a defeated state as I caught my breath. As I stepped back, an aggressive and almost angry-sounding banging began to erupt from the floor hatch. The hatch itself was thrashing and repeatedly slamming against the ground from the intense pounding. Dirt and loose hay was being kicked up and flung across the barn as a result. I immediately jumped as a natural reflex and my eyes went wide. The animals were going crazy in response, spinning in circles, making noises that weren't in their usual range of auditory vocabulary. They seemed even more freaked out than I was, almost as if they had gone through this before. I stood frozen. My mind was racing and I felt my muscles tense up as I tried to figure out what to do in the terrifying moment. The animals only became more freaked out as the banging continued. I was surprised the cows didn't end up breaking out of their pens and hightailing it to town. However, mercy had seemed to have fallen upon me when the banging finally ceased. The floor hatch became still once more, and I could feel myself relax, but only slightly. The terror in my veins was still as potent as viper venom. I did the only intelligent thing at the time and simply turned around and ran, not even daring to stop or look back until I was back at the house and safely inside. I snatched my keys right out of my pocket and practically shanked it into the doorknob and unlocked it as fast as humanly possible before throwing myself inside. When Mr. Roberts had gotten back from the store just an hour later, I had done a decent job of playing off what I had attempted to do, and simply went about pretending that it was just another ordinary day for the two of us. It seemed to have worked well, but I couldn't get the question of whatever the heck that thing was down there out of my mind. Did he have animals secretly locked up underneath the barn? Was it some sort of creature, something dangerous trying to break out? Answers raced through my mind as I let my imagination run wild, with whatever horrifying entity could have resided in that isolated expanse. It became clear that this day would serve as a lesson to not disobey Mr. Roberts again. I had misjudged his sternness as him being uptight, rather than trying to protect me. That's what it had to be. Even though I couldn't stop thinking about the hatch, I still went on conversing and trying to have a pleasant time with Mr. Roberts. We discussed typical farm work along with some pop culture. Mr. Roberts usually focused on books in particular. He said those were the easiest form of media to consume for him. "You okay tonight, Sarah?" He questioned as he bit into a dinner roll. "You usually got a little more pep in your step, usually during these talks." "Sorry," I responded quickly, sliding my fork mindlessly around my plate like a child. "I think I just need some sleep. If you want to take up some more responsibility around the farm, I can make that happen." He smiled widely, but after the events of today, it came off as more unsettling rather than comforting. I could feel myself involuntarily grip my fork with more force than necessary. "Yeah, I think that would be a good idea," I replied in a more spaced out and unengaged tone. "Well, tomorrow morning I actually need to run to the bank for a bit. I was wondering if you could head over to the barn and milk the cows for me. I felt my blood run cold as soon as the words left his lips. The thought of going back to the barn, not even 24 hours after what had transpired, made my stomach churn with an underlying sense of apprehension. "Oh, yeah, sure, I guess I can do that," I managed to squeeze out before poking at my steak and piercing it with my fork. The rest of the night went as expected. We both finished dinner, cleaned up and washed our plates, and began to get ready for bed. I was praying that a good night's sleep would be the solution to my now cursed psyche. But Mother Nature would soon prove me wrong. The wind outside was strong. It howled obnoxiously loud as it whipped past the structure of the house, leaving me no choice but to bury my face between two pillows in a desperate attempt to drown out the noise. I knew that without the necessary sleep, I would be extremely exhausted when trying to do all my chores in the morning. Eventually, the grogginess did overwhelm me and I passed out. I ended up having a short nightmare of some sort relating to the hatch, but I couldn't remember the specifics. All I know is that when I woke up, my heart was beating at an unnaturally high rate, and images of the hatch opening kept replaying in my head on a loop. I got dressed and headed outside, making my way around the side of the house to the shed, where a lot of the equipment I needed was stored, which just so happened to be on the same side as where my bedroom was located. But when I stepped around the side of the house, a sight that I know for a fact was undeniably real made me stop dead in my tracks, as my jaw sank straight to the earth. Just inches to the side of the glass that was my bedroom window were long, jagged, deep-looking claw marks that looked as if they had been messily dragged up and down the wood panel exterior. They looked like something not even a human being with blades could do. The general disorder and mismatched order of them made it all the more disturbing. Animals big enough to do that didn't come anywhere near here, and I know for a fact that I didn't hear any scratching the previous night. I stood there, frozen like a statue, as I attempted to contemplate what my next course of action should be. I was truly petrified at the thought of the creature still being close. It took every ounce of mental fortitude and courage I had to finally start moving again. I dashed towards the barn in a full-on sprint, not stopping for even a nanosecond, as I pumped my legs with what little energy I had left over. When I got there and came to a halt in my panting state, the door to the barn was already open, but the chains in the lock had been forcibly torn off and thrown to the side. I darted my eyes around the interior, only to see that all the animals were gone from their enclosures. Not because the pens themselves were open either. They had simply vanished into thin air. That's what it seemed like until the most foul smell of decomposition and rotting flesh flooded my nostrils, like some sort of horrid tsunami. My hands were shaking vigorously. Scratch that, my entire body was. Every single bone in me vibrated as if I had just climbed out of freezing cold water. What really didn't help was the trail of blood beginning at the door leading all the way to the hatch, which was now open. The sight of it was so strangely but powerfully menacing that it made every stop I took feel like I was about to lose my balance and fall over from how intensely I was shaking. My movements were slow and deliberate. I could feel my existential fear only increase with every inch closer I got. The sound of flesh tearing and bones crunching together only made it worse, and I had to use maximum effort to restrain myself from having a complete mental breakdown right then and there. I stopped just a foot before the entrance to the hatch, and when I tell you that I will never forget looking down there for the rest of my life, I mean it. Down the short ladder was a complete coat of blood, and pieces of animals from a variety of them splattered all over the ladder and wall of the room. At the bottom of the ladder sat an otherworldly and alien-looking humanoid figure, its rotting, yellowish-colored skin sharing a similar texture to that of a rug. Its arms were disproportionately long to the rest of its body, and the same applied to its legs. It was in a hunched over position as it tore away at whatever it was violently feasting on. I could see small pieces of bone almost forcing their way out of its back. The creature sensed my presence, however, and abruptly stopped consuming its meal, turning around to reveal its misshapen torso and 3 heads. The thing had 3 freaking heads, all identical to each other. The heads were all completely bald and shaped like deformed ovals. They each had a mouth lined with razor-sharp but rotting teeth that were jagged in almost impossible ways. Each head had a pair of 2 white piercing eyes that stared into my soul with nothing but hatred and hunger within them. I vomited when I caught a glimpse of Mr. Roberts' torn apart, absolutely shredded corpse that it had clenched in its multiple inch-long dirt-covered fingernails. The only clue of it being Mr. Roberts was the fact that the general head structure was still intact, but it was obvious that it wouldn't stay that way for long. The creature let out an ear-piercing, blood-curdling shriek as it began to latch itself to the wall and crawl upwards toward me in a spider-like fashion. The sounds of its elongated claws colliding with concrete walls only made my seemingly impending doom that much more horrific. I quickly reacted and reached over to slam the hatch shut, but not before I caught all 3 of the heads simultaneously shooting me a truly sinister and deeply frightening grin. Once the hatch was shut and fully secured, I had bolted it yet again in a crying, teary-eyed panic. But when I ran away this time, I knew for a fact that I was never coming back. Not to this farm, the barn, or that stupid hatch. Now that I'm typing this up, years later, I can safely say that city life is much better, for me at least. I'm never visiting any farm ever again. I wish that I had someone to talk about my experiences with. I even thought about booking a therapist. But all I need for you to know is that when someone goes to great lengths to warn you of something, for the love of God, please listen. Curiosity, fun, and adventure are not worth it. There are things in the world that humans were never meant to coexist with. Don't go looking for them, because I guarantee that if you find them, they've already had their eye on you for a while.